Yeah, it's live. Okay, cool. Success. Hello, Internet. This is people talking about Harry Potter. And this is our first discussion of Chamber of Secrets, which is a book
Yeah, it's
in the
this
Harry
one.
Potter series that I feel like people would know if they're watching the video because it kind of says on the video title. So we're going to talk about the first. Ooh, I shook my book. Wow. We're going to talk about the first two chapters of Chamber of Secrets. Yay!
Yay!
Yeah. So, brief introduction. What else does the internet need to know? / we need to know. Oh, I'm Tren. Other people can say their name and wave enthusiastically or not.
I'm Hilda.
I'm Dory.
Alejandro.
Cool. That feels like we've done introductions. We can move on to the next bullet point in the agenda. So we're going to talk first about queer theory and like queer identity. The first thing we're going to focus on is just like what queer theory even is, because some people don't know what that is. I don't fully even know what it is. People do entire degrees on it, so. But it's basically looking at literature from a queer perspective. That's like the very broad definition. And queer being the umbrella term for gay, lesbian, bi, pan, asexual, transgender, all the things. I know I forgot things. I don't remember.
All the letters.
All the letters.
The whole alphabet soup.
Intersex also gets left out a lot. That's a thing. Why is there? I don't like when I'm not centered. I'm still not centered. Okay. Yeah. So. Oh, this link. I should have linked things in the description. I didn't. So one of the sources I pulled up for our agenda, which I should add to the description on the video after we're done, had some questions for analyzing media texts from a queer cultural studies perspective. So I'm going to read those questions, and then we're not necessarily going to like talk about all of them. So if you're looking at the agenda, do you guys have the agenda? I can link it to you.
I have it I have it.
Do.
I'll link it in the chat right now,
Cool.
just so you guys can look at it if you want to be looking along. Yeah, this feels very like serious right now. So the questions are: how does the product reinforce or disrupt traditional dichotomies and/or associations among them? Examples are like white, black, straight, gay, masculine, feminine, male, female, good, evil. 2, how does the product reinforce or disrupt the modern notion of essentialist, the idea that sexuality and gender are ahistorical and fixed in biology? Essentialist gender or sexual identities. 3, how does the product reinforce or disrupt heterosexuality or its presumptions about the continuities, congruencies, or stability of the relationships between sex, gender, and desire? 4, can this text be read against the grain to unearth hidden queer meanings and pleasures? It's a weird word. 5, how does the product represent the product of othering, giving subjectivity, voice, primary position to certain characters while marginalizing, such as silencing, stigmatizing, or objectifying other characters? So that's a lot of stuff to talk about.
It is.
But we're just going to talk about the first few chapters.
Yeah, I was kind of when I knew the topic like beforehand, and I was like, before I reread the chapters, I was like, what is like LGBT stuff in those chapters? Like nothing. I couldn't like think of anything. But then I reread it today because I like to leave things to the last minute, and I actually saw some things that I realized like, oh, you can kind of read into that there.
Yeah, I have notes. Some of mine are notes from like years ago too. My books are all filled with notes. I've shown them on like the first stream, I think. Yeah, but actually, I would like you to talk about what you saw then first, because I don't need to talk all the time.
Oh, yeah. One of the things was that kind of when those people are coming over, the Masons, right?
Yeah.
I reread it in Dutch, so I didn't really remember the English name. But they come, and then like Harry has to hide upstairs, and that was like a thing that I was like forced to like hide your identity because it's clearly because he's a wizard.
Yeah.
Because they don't want him to pull any like magic tricks or whatever. So that was like that could kind of be a situation where you're forced to like hide your identity in like a super literal sense. But that was definitely something I could like read it into. And there was something else. But I have forgotten what it was. I should have written it down, but I didn't. But I might remember it later on, and I'll let you know.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a pretty like blatant
The most obvious one.
parallel.
Yeah.
Did anybody else have any?
Oh yeah, I remember what it was.
Okay, cool.
The Harry was not allowed to say the word magic.
The M word.
Yeah.
Or like because at a certain point they're like having some sort of meal. I don't remember. And like Dudley asks Harry to pass the bacon or whatever, and Harry's like, "You forgot the magic word," and he meant like "please" or whatever. But Vernon Dursley explodes, saying he's not allowed to say the M word, which kind of reminded me of that whole like "don't say gay" bill that was maybe still going on. I think in Texas. So that was also something that I was.
Or Russia.
Or Russia. Good one.
China.
It's definitely still going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So but yeah, that was.
Yeah, definitely. Does anybody else have something on there before I say things? I don't want to like. Okay, yeah, because those are some of the things that I wrote down. I specifically, like, I have a note here that just right where in that same scene where Uncle Vernon's like, "I warned you, I will not tolerate a mention of your abnormality under this roof." I just wrote, "Sounds like Harry said he was gay or something." It actually would have been like a few years ago.
Accurate.
Yeah. And it's like, it's interesting because Harry just casually says something that isn't really saying like, "Hey, I'm a wizard," but it reminds people of his identity. And so, like, there's this thing where it's like, I think people who have to, like, who aren't comfortably out often have to avoid saying certain things that might make people suspect they're gay. So it's like, so like you don't want to accidentally, I don't know, like there's just this more like fear of saying the wrong thing, and Harry just says the word, pass the, or what's the magic word, which is a completely normal thing to do, but in the context of Harry's identity, it suddenly becomes this like loaded, awful thing to say. Like if anybody else had said, "What's the magic word?" it wouldn't have been.
No. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's like this.
But in this case, it's not really Harry that has the problem with it. It's like Vernon Dursley.
Yeah, Harry's already out, so it's a little different, but it's also just like relates to the like taboo of words.
There's one that I noticed, if I can interject.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm sorry, I don't have the exact phrase. I actually lost my copy of the book, and that's like the only book I'm missing right now. So I resorted to using the audiobook online, and something.
Sorry, it crushed my heart.
It is my third favorite book, also, and somehow like I don't remember how I lost it. I always have all my books together, and then I realized I'm missing that one of all of them. So I guess I need to get a new copy at some point. But regardless, one of the phrases, it might not be exact, but it was something from the narration. It was them saying he was not as normal as possible or something like that. Like it was like he's the farthest thing from normal. So it was kind of like discussing the normalization of certain identities. In his case, of course, being a Muggle is what was normal, and then being a wizard was not normal. And you can kind of put that in like into relation with sexuality, gender identity, ability, other statuses like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting the way, and this will connect like when we move on from queer identity into other identities, just like the way that Harry Potter presents like this alternative, like other being the normal, and it just like flips the idea of what's normal on its head. So it works for a lot of identities and not just queer identity, but I think queer identity is one of the ones that's very easy to draw out, maybe partly just because there's a whole academic world of queer theory to help.
No, but definitely, because like Harry, like in this book even, but also like in the entire series, Harry kind of starts out as the outcast in the Muggle world, and then he comes into this new community that is totally like everybody there is like him. Like he goes to Hogwarts, and it's like, oh, so I'm not the weird one. Although he's still kind of special because he's Harry Potter, but not for being magical.
Yeah, it's in a way it's like a coming out story, and like it is a coming of age story, but it's like specifically like a going from a world where you don't feel accepted and being able to find a world where there's other people like you. So like for some people the experience of coming out is less about like the non-acceptance and more about finding the community that is accepting. Like it's leaving the closet and going to Hogwarts.
This is where your shirt comes in.
Harry actually did leave the closet. Yeah. And it's also interesting to me, which is not as directly on topic, but by the end of these chapters, Harry ends up locked in his room and never comes out. And I just wonder, like, why don't the neighbors notice?
Yeah, good point.
So it makes me wonder about like other ways that like if actually Harry is just gay and that's why he's locked up, and he gets locked up for his, like, do neighbors not notice somebody locking up a kid that's been around for 11 years?
But also it's the kind of neighborhood where everybody's like, everything's perfect, don't pay attention to anything that's not perfect. So I think it would get ignored very easily.
I think it would, because like Aunt Petunia's like checking out the neighbors trying to find their problems.
I know.
I have a feeling like everybody's going like, ooh, let's find out what dirt we can get on the Dursleys.
One thing that confuses me, isn't Miss Fig supposed to be working for Dumbledore and like kind of keeping an eye on it? That's probably a continuity issue, but yeah, there is that.
Yeah. I don't think Dumbledore cares if Harry gets locked in a room all summer.
Actually, you're probably right. Probably cares, but thinks for the greater good. It's
for the greater good. Let's let this child suffer lots of abuse. That way he can go die in a few years.
Yeah. Oh, if you put it like that.
Dumbledore's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's. Let me see if there's one other thing. Oh, let me just glance at the questions that I talked about.
Yeah, I think that was another one that kind of stuck out. One of the questions. The one about what gets presented as normal. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Especially with like the Dursleys, because it's like super, super normal. Even if you view it from like a queer theory perspective, it is kind of the man and the woman, and the man has the job, and it's like an important thing. And so the woman like cooks for the important people that come for the man. You know, kind of like that. So even as Muggles, they are super normal, but also just like as like hetero people.
Yeah, and like so does Harry Potter in a way, because the Dursleys are presented as this like normal and like in a bad way is Harry Potter pushing back against those gender norms?
By contrast, I don't know. Not like explicitly.
Yeah.
But I guess by writing them so super normal and super, I guess, what's expected, and Harry being not what's expected, without Harry even going like, screw you, you're just trying to be perfect or trying to be normal or whatever. He never says anything like that. But just by the contrast of him being there, existing in that family, I guess it's a little bit of a pushback thing.
Although on the other hand, the Weasleys, Mr. Weasley goes to work, Mrs. Weasley does all the housework.
That's true.
They're not really radical.
But Mrs. Weasley, also, spoiler alert, is like a super warrior. I mean, I guess people probably have read Book 7, but, you know, she kills Dumbledore.
Thanks for that spoiler alert for the people who still haven't read Harry Potter.
I mean, it would be maybe, I guess maybe if people are, like, reading it for the first time.
It is called the Harry Potter reread, just to be clear for everybody.
Maybe I'll reread for Chamber of Secrets.
Yeah.
Some of this is also like, and that's a pretty cool thing. Like that goes way outside of these chapters, but that in like there might be like stereotypical gender norms in the wizarding community, like totally with like the Weasleys, but like other families too, the Malfoys and like everybody. But when it comes to fighting, they're equals. Mm-hmm. It's not like the men go to war and the women don't.
Yeah. Well, they have a pretty small community.
What?
Keep in mind that in some families, like, you know, it still might make more sense for that individual man to be working, that individual woman to be at home. But however, it's not really kind of making that standard be for everybody else. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong if that family decides for themselves without any individual influence. So maybe they're, you know, maybe they're just happier that way as an individual family. Yeah. However, forcing all men to work and all women to stay at home is obviously part of the problem. You know, having that kind of social expectation.
Yeah, and also the thing with Harry Potter is that J.K. Rowling made all these decisions. She could have made a decision to say, okay, in this family, we're going to make the situation such that the mom is the breadwinner type and the dad stays like that. That was just her decision. It was there's no external forces on like the Weasley family for how their family is set up because J.K. Rowling made all of them. She made a fictional world. She could have just as easily created. Thank you so much. I love you, Dory. Oh. Okay. The last thing I wanted to just like briefly go over before moving on to our next agenda item was just sort of like I'm not wording this well, but like the significance of having a story that young queer people could find themselves in. I know Harry Potter does not do a good job of representation of non-cisgender heterosexual people, and arguably has none, depending on whether you count J.K. Rowling just announcing randomly things as canon. I don't. But the fact that you can read into the story and like find an identity, like
I think that's really, really important. It's like growing up, I didn't even know what the word lesbian meant until I was like a high schooler. And like I didn't know that was like an option and that was who I thought it was like a bad word. And I think that it's because I mean in kids' books you don't have gay characters. I mean, you don't have. There's really nothing out there. And
well, that's funny. I was within like the Harry Potter Alliance. They were looking for stories that kind of inspired you towards like fan activism, but also like themes like this that I don't know, helped you think a certain way. And I realized that my favorite book as a kid totally did have gay characters. They were not prominent characters at all, but they definitely used those words like gay, lesbian, whatever in the book, which was like, I read that book when I was 8. So
that's the book I have?
No,
Is it that one? Oh, okay. I was like, I'm going to read that right now then.
No, that one does not have any diversity whatsoever.
Okay, that's disappointing.
Like, it's,
someone read it.
I have it right there. Wait, 1 second. I'll go get it.
I just noticed one of my agenda items for the next thing says read through this radius. That was a note to self, by the way.
You missed that note?
I didn't get a chance to finish things.
It is this book, which
isn't that also on your list?
It is also on my list.
I need to read that one too.
Het heet Polke. Oh, sorry, that was some unexpected Dutch. It's called Polke.
I understood.
Awesome. And it's basically about this kid who is like, she's 11 years old, she writes poetry, she has a dad who is homeless and addicted to drugs. Her mom is in love with her teacher, she has a boyfriend who is Moroccan, and she has a best friend who has 2 dads. So that's kind of how it's worked into the story. So yeah, this was what I was reminded of. But this is not the Harry Potter reread stuff. So let's go back to Harry Potter.
After we finish reading Harry Potter,
burned in Elizabeth.
I'll read that Dutch book after.
Cool.
Yeah, okay. So I think that we should move on to talking about disability and like neurodivergence is probably an easier one. Using kind of the ideas of queer theory, there's also lots of ideas around disability studies that you can look into. But now, going back over these chapters, and instead of reading them looking for queer themes, looking at like Harry as like a metaphor for a disabled or neurodivergent kid, and the attitudes of those around him towards his magicness. Yeah, I have thoughts, but if somebody else has thoughts on this first, I will let other people go.
You can go first.
Yeah, why don't you start us off?
Okay. So I specifically have read this as like looking at Harry as like autistic or otherwise different ability, as people might say. I don't use that. But we would be seen as disabled in some way, whether like developmentally or in some other way. And the way that the Dursleys treat that, because Harry is not well suited to the Muggle world. He doesn't fit in well. His abilities are not in line with the structure set up in the Muggle world. But he does have strengths. His strengths are like magic. He has no outlet for his strengths in the Muggle world, in the existing world he's been raised in, and the people who've raised him, instead of going, wow, you have these strengths in this other like context that would be great, they're just like, but you don't fit this exact model, therefore you're awful. Don't say that word.
Yeah.
And they treat Harry like he's a burden and like he's a difficulty rather than being at all helpful or supportive. And they hide him away a lot, which is kind of like a thing that some not great parents sometimes do with their disabled kids or kids with disabilities, depending on how you want to word that. I Yeah, those are my initial thoughts on this thing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think you're totally right.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think, like, if the Dursleys did have a disabled kid, I wonder how they would treat that kid. I doubt it would be very good.
Well, I think there is after Dudley, the Dementors, since the Dementors are basically our depression, they sort of deal with some mental illness at one point. I don't think they do a great job.
No,
they just blame Harry.
Yeah.
Their response is just to blame something external and not go like, gee, my kid's freaking out right now. Let's give him emotional support. No, it's like, who can we attack?
Yeah. I forgot about that.
The thing I most identify with this is that, like, Harry's normal is not the Dursleys' normal.
Yeah.
And, like, that's a very real thing when you have a disability or chronic illness, is you do things really differently, and what seems like a little thing to you may be big to something else, or what's a little thing to someone else may be a huge thing for you. And I feel like that sort of othering and different I feel like that's very strong in these chapters.
Yeah, I definitely feel. I mean, I don't have a chronic illness. I'm autistic, which is like it's different. It's but yeah, it's yes. I appreciate you sharing that. That's I don't have anything to add on to that other than yeah, thank you. I think one of the other things that was interesting for me was this idea. There's this idea, at least within the autistic community, and I think it's a general idea within anybody with like an invisible illness, of passing. So some people, if you're autistic, you might say you pass as neurotypical, so you can. Other people might not know you're autistic immediately, and that's actually also a thing within the transgender and even gay community, queer in general communities. This idea of being able to pass as normal, whatever that is, and I think in the wizarding world we see that wizards have different levels of ability to pass. Like some wizards, they cannot figure out Muggle clothing at all. They just flat out, the guy wearing a dress or whatever, and people are like, what?
And then you have the Mr. Crouches.
Yeah, other ones who pass really well.
But then again, the Crouchers are very good at keeping secrets.
Do you think being able to pass is a privilege?
I think it's a really complex.
A good thing?
I think it's really complex to
I think it depends on the situation. Definitely, there are times when passing gives you certain benefits from society that that your actual group might not be receiving if they were more open about it. But there are other times when it's just mentally debilitating to not be able to be yourself and express yourself as part of your community. So I think it really depends.
Yeah, and I think, at least for people with invisible illnesses, but I think this is also a thing within the queer community, the idea of passing isn't always a privilege in that, like, if you pass, people don't believe, if you pass as neurotypical, people are like, oh, you're not autistic. Like, you can't be autistic. Like, I've had people tell me, like, no, you're not autistic, or you're not really autistic, you're just, like, autistic light. And I'm like, excuse me. And I think that happens in the queer community too, with the queer community not being always very nice to people who pass as straight and cisgender, because they're like, oh well, you're not really, gay, or not really, like whatever it is, like you don't. it's basically Oppression Olympics.
Yeah.
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 I think like in the physical disabilities and like obvious chronic illness, I also think that being able to pass is a good thing. Like to be treated normally, because people treat you very, very differently when.
Yeah, no, I definitely. No, it's complicated because there's definitely privileges to passing, and I haven't noticed the disability community being as awful about like, oh, you're not disabled enough to be part of our club, as the queer community gets.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
Yeah, there are problems. I'll just leave it at that. There's a group of people with a certain illness who may or may not have it, who create problems for other people within the disabled community and often drive them out of safe places.
Yeah. Actually, also on the subject of passing, people who use this is at least a thing in the U.S., we have a placard you put in your car or in your license plate for being disabled. So you get closer to parking spots. And so my mother has an invisible illness and has one of those and has had one of those for a long time. But she doesn't look obviously disabled, and so people will, like, I saw something on Facebook recently, somebody left a note to somebody like, how dare you use the spot, you're not disabled. Like, so if you pass, sometimes people will be very upset with you for using supports that you need, supports and services that you need, and so that's, I think that it just gets complicated. Passing is complicated.
Very good.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help when there is actually people who would do something, somebody who's able-bodied who would be taking advantage of one of those parking spots or other space that should be for somebody who does have a disability.
Yeah, no, I've seen plenty of people use the disabled parking spots as a loading zone or just using it in general. I've actually seen people pull into them and be like, hey, my mother does this thing where she just tells people, like, oh, hey, you forgot to put your placard up. Because usually she knows that the person didn't forget and they're just using the spot, but she doesn't want to be like...
Yeah, that's actually a really good way of doing that.
Yeah.
And they're always just like, oh, no, I'm just using it for a minute. And it's like, no, you don't understand. That's not how it works.
No.
You don't just use it for a minute. And people get very upset about that, too. It's very strange. I don't know why people think that they have a right to that spot.
Well, people are defensive, even if they know they're doing something wrong. I actually, yesterday, somebody was picking up branches from the cherry blossom trees in D.C. Those are, like, sacred. Nobody's supposed to be touching them. And people are, like, removing the branches, and one of my friends went up to them and told them that's not right, and they just looked at him like he was doing something wrong. Same thing, I think, would apply with a situation like this.
Yeah. I'm reminding myself that the way this connects to Harry Potter is we were talking about passing in the Muggle world for wizards. I'm also reminding anybody else who forgot. Because I was like, wait, weren't we talking about Harry Potter? It is Harry Potter.
It is.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes me wonder, like, if Harry passed as normal better. But actually, I think Harry passes as a Muggle very well, but the Dursleys don't see that.
Yeah.
So, like, there's no way Harry could pass enough for them.
I was wondering if maybe, like, in the wizarding world, it is considered disabled if a kid is born without magical powers, like squibs.
If they're squib?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's probably, like, a disability within... I mean, I don't know if the wizarding community uses the word disabled at all, because we we see no disabled people at Hogwarts. There's no discussion. I mean, the best we have is like Moody is missing a leg.
Yeah.
And an eye. He has a magical eye. I mean, there's not a whole lot of...
hand at one point is kind of...
Yeah.
But that's not really...
It's a little different than
yeah.
disability.
It's more of an injury.
World.
Well, you could also think of the Gaunt family as having disabilities in some ways. I think the way that they were kind of portrayed as like it sounds like they were portrayed like as an inbred like families who like would not mix with others. I think that's another way to look at disability as well, like in the series.
I don't remember much about that. It's been a while since I've read that part, but yeah. I think I'm not good at math. Oh, wait, I am good at math, right? So, oh, okay. I think we can actually, if you guys are all okay with it, segue onto talking about fat shaming in Harry Potter. We kind of segued a little bit when we started talking about invisible illness, and because sometimes there's weight issues and people will blame somebody like, oh, you're just overweight. You're not disabled. Nice. Ooh, I just segued. Yeah. What did I put in here? Oh, there was an article in The Guardian recently that I linked that I'm not sure actually how I feel about it. But it was saying that fat shaming is basically as disgusting as any other prejudice, and it compares like fat shaming with the same sort of treatment towards other eating disorders like anorexia, and how we've shifted from shaming people for having a food-related disorder to like going, oh wow, you have a disorder.
I think though that people's reaction to people who have an eating disorder or like who have like anorexia versus how people react to fat people are very different. So
yeah, no, this article is saying it's different and that it should be the same.
Oh, okay.
The article is basically saying we should treat people who have a food-related disorder that causes like overeating and major weight gain as the same as a disorder for not eating.
Well, to me, I do feel like it's all body shaming in one way or another.
Yeah.
Most of the time, you're not really bringing to attention that person's actual health, like the habits that go into making sure that their body's overall balanced. But it's more about pointing out that they're either too big, too small, like something's wrong with their size, and that has a direct relation to their health. And I do feel like fat shaming is a lot more common in the society, but I do feel like skinny shaming is extremely common as well, and just as problematic. It doesn't really help people get any better if they're unhealthy, and some people are just healthy and skinny, just like some people are healthy and fat.
I think as someone who has been underweight my whole life, I would argue that skinny shaming is not really a thing. Like I've been teased for being too skinny and made fun of it, but not to the extent that my character hasn't been attacked for my weight. Nobody's like, oh wow, you're lazy and stupid because you're skinny.
Yeah, I think like it's hard, and I think there's a danger in equating like obesity to eating disorders.
Yeah.
Because
that was my one difficulty with this article.
Obesity is multifactorial, and I feel like not a mental health issue.
Yeah. And the article talks about they say certain types of obesity.
Yeah.
Like they're not trying to say that all types, but I don't think that is the majority, or like I don't think the majority of obesity is due to a mental disorder. I think there's other factors going on. Yeah.
Has anyone else noticed that, like, British authors seem to do it more? Like, do the fat shaming more in their books?
Maybe they're just making fun of what they think Americans are, because that's the American stereotype to be. Like,
well, as I think the only non-American here, I can definitely say that this is a giant stereotype.
Yeah, I was gonna say
I don't. You probably know how the rest of the world views Americans, or how Europeans view Americans, but it's definitely. There's definitely a stereotype, and it very much involves people who are overweight, especially like for some reason Texas. I don't know why.
well, Texas. Let's not talk about Texas.
I don't know if it's based in statistics at all, but yeah.
Texas does not have great health, actually. You're not.
Yeah, Texas
I don't know anything about Texas.
I lived in Texas.
Oh yeah, Houston. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess Houston isn't quite Texas.
I don't know.
Yeah, so actually that's interesting. The European idea of like fat shaming America, kind of, because I feel like those stereotypes about America aren't just like, oh, Americans are just larger than other people. They're like, Americans are fat and stupid and dumb.
Yeah.
Like
but
that.
At the same time, we so look up to America too, like, because all the trends that come here, or like a lot of the trends are from America, and like
all of the me's, all the trends.
Yeah. But yeah, at the same, it's this weird two-sided thing where on the one hand we're like, Americans are this, and this, like fat, stupid, I don't know, a number of negative things, but at the same time, like a lot of our fashion, a lot of our technology, a lot of stuff comes from America, and in those cases we like super admire America, and it's also like a powerful nation, I guess, politically speaking.
Yeah.
And so it's a weird double thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have one viewer. That just went up. Hello, viewer.
Hi, viewer.
I don't know who the viewer is, but hello. Yeah, and I think, so, back to Harry Potter, I guess. I just pulled up other articles about people wrote about fat shaming Harry Potter, and specifically, a lot of it is about Dudley and how a lot of the portrayal of Dudley is like, look, he's fat, therefore Dudley is, let's not like Dudley.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, though, the only other character who is like mentioned as somebody who's fat is the fat lady. Like, I don't think any of the Hogwarts students are overweight.
Wasn't Neville considered overweight?
Slughorn.
Just a movie.
Oh yeah,
but Neville is described as chubby, which is definitely a way more friendly way to say something about.
Yeah, that's the like.
Appearance.
You're overweight, but you're not lazy, awful, terrible human. You are still a good human. You are not quite. You've not gone to the point that we no longer accept you as human.
Or an alien.
Like
yeah, I couldn't think of anybody else.
And the thing is, like, the way Dudley's weight is described is really gross. Like, the point is that it's gross, but, like, there's some line. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, it's Dudley, who was so large his bottom drooped over either side of the kitchen chair, grinned and turned to Harry. Yeah. Like, did we really need that sentence?
No,
What if Dudley just grinned and turned to Harry? Do we really need a visual of his butt hanging off the edge of the chair? I feel like the portrayal of Dudley is very, it spends a lot of time on, like, showing his weight as a way of being negative.
I see the symbolic, like, value in it, of, like, Dudley being given everything, and Harry being given nothing, like, in that family. And to have, like, food as a metaphor for that. Because Harry is super, super skinny and, like, underweight and sometimes, like, is starved.
He could have been, like, buff Dudley, though. Like, what if Dudley just got everything and got, like, buff?
But it's like, At the same
But
time,
also-
though, like the way that the Dursleys treat Dudley is very much like they give him too much attention and too much, like everything is too much, like what they give to him.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, they give him a gross amount of attention and care and like in all the bad ways. But
Yeah.
I know, like, so I see like the metaphor there, but the way it's described is definitely not necessary.
But
Yeah.
I think that gets into one of the problems with like literary that is a metaphor. Like that metaphor itself isn't a very good metaphor. It's so overused, where we can show that somebody's not a good character by giving them lots of food and making them seem lazy. And like there were other ways to make Dudley seem over attentions. Like he could have just had like helicopter mom type thing, where his mom's just involved in everything and she's helping him with his homework all the time, and like there were other ways to show that. And also, like weight is not just proportional to the amount of food you eat. Like it's so much more complicated than that, and they could have been like, Dudley has so much food all the time. He's super healthy and great. Like
Yeah.
you could have done the metaphor that way. It's such a
He could have been a jog.
overused. What?
He could have been a jog.
Yeah,
It could have been.
a total
And
jock.
It's totally. I'm not defending J.K. Rowling at all.
Yeah.
I was just trying to figure out why she could have possibly
No.
done that.
No, I get that, and I think it's like, yeah, that's why she did that, but she didn't have to. Yeah, that was her choice, and she could have chosen a different way that didn't fetch, or she could have had like heroes who were fat and
Yeah.
like, yeah, they're great people. They're not lazy. They're not dumb. Their weight has nothing to do with their intelligence or their ability to do things in general. or their worth. Pardon?
And I think there's... Go ahead.
Oh, I said I was trying to find a word, perseverance. Or
Yeah.
not being lazy, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting juxtaposition between Dudley and Hermione, because I feel like Hermione's got the, her parents give her lots of really healthy, like, we find out she gives them lots of healthy food and sugar-free snacks and all of that, and, they love her, and they give her a lot of attention and love, and, well, maybe I should say Malfoy's better. I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like,
Yeah.
Hermione has very similar circumstances, but is not damaged by her upbringing.
Yeah. I mean, Malfoy is damaged by his upbringing, so you could have done something like that with Dudley.
Yeah.
Like he did.
I think doing more of a Malfoy than a Dudley.
Or Harry's best friend could have been overweight, and they, describe him as fat and whatever, and like, but his best friend is great, Like it could have like that. You could have chosen that. There were so many decisions to make that would have, because there's this like long-term existing narrative of, like, this article I was reading was saying, let me see, it was talking about Kidlit specifically. It says in most of Kidlit, as well as movies, when others are teased or mocked, there's usually a lesson to be learned. Bullying is bad, but fat characters are the exception to that rule. Making fun of them and teasing them is often portrayed as justified and deserved. And also later in this book we get Crabbe and Goyle, ha ha ha, we lured them with food, because they're so dumb, fat, and whatever, like, J.K. Rowling, come on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really bad.
This was...
Has anybody read what J.K. Rowling wrote about fat shaming, though? About how like...
Yeah, I think...
About how people shouldn't be shaming others for being fat, that there's other worse things, like, there was a list of things she said about a person's personality that would make them worse than being fat, and that she would, she did not like that how people, and especially girls, were treated because of their bodies.
I remember, though, later on in that quote, I read it a long time ago, but I think she said at one point, like, that she didn't want her daughters to grow up as, like, rat-faced supermodels or whatever. And I was like, whoa, that's bad. I am not 100% sure what exactly she said, so I'm going to fact-check myself right now. But I read that and I was like, ooh, J.K. Rowling, not right.
Yeah, and I think
Let me see if I can find that quote.
I think that quote or whatever I think it was like a blog post I guess she made. I would categorize that along with the Outing Dumbledore post series, where it's like, yeah, you can go and say that later, but it doesn't change the fact that you wrote a series that stands on its own, that has messages in it. Like, she can't undo that her series is not very great. You can't just go back and say, well, you know, there was a Jewish character, I swear.
And also, like,
unless she wants to, like, rewrite half the books and republish them.
I agree, but, like, I'm just wondering if she wrote that, like, as a reaction to what people might have been critiquing what she originally said in the book about the Dursleys, and maybe she realized and checked herself. I don't know if she ever apologized for that, or if she ever made any comments, but I was wondering if maybe that was a reaction to that. I mean, there were several things that I consider messed up in the Harry Potter books, and maybe she was just trying to learn from the comments she was receiving, or maybe she realized later on that she shouldn't have said those things.
Yeah. No, I'm not trying to say J.K. Rowling's like an awful person.
I
think just when looking at a text, you're looking at a text, you're not looking at the entirety of everything she's ever said. You're looking at the Harry Potter series does this part wrong, and she can't retroactively fix the Harry Potter series.
No.
Other than republishing, like she can't make Dumbledore gay by saying he's gay. She can't go back and say, oh, by the way, Ron's also actually gay, so we can get some
I really wish that in those letters between Dumbledore and Grindelwald there had been some, I don't know, that would have been, like, because for Dumbledore to proclaim in front of the school his identity, like, that, I can see how that's hard to work into the books. Like, why would he go up to Hogwarts and be like, da-da-da? Whereas I thought a great opportunity for that to be kind of part of the story was that Rita Skeeter book. But at the same time, I would also be terrified of Rita Skeeter being super homophobic and that becoming a problem. But there could have been, like, I wish that in those letters he had said, like, I love you or whatever. I don't know, anything. That could have been cool. That was an opportunity.
Yeah, and also Dumbledore, whenever he talks to Harry about how love can also be used as a tool, and you know, not for necessarily good things, but it can also be used to manipulate people, that would have been a perfect example right there, too, to explain it.
Yeah.
And I'm not justifying J.K. Rowling at all, but for not including that part, but I do feel like also there would have been a lot of backlash. Because you know how people are so sensitive about homosexuality.
But people already didn't like Harry Potter. It was already banned in my school. Like, she was.
But
she had already distanced a lot of the people who would have been most upset. I mean, the other thing is, like, Rick Riordan did that too. I mean, he had a gay character, and it wasn't a big deal. It was just like one of the kids in the series is gay.
But I also wonder how many countries would have, or states or areas that would have banned the book altogether, just even if there was one brief mention of homosexuality. That's how some people are when they see that topic. It's the worst thing in the world to them. And so I kind of understand. She was doing, you know, I don't know if this was her intention, but, you know, excluding that topic let the books have more, you know, of an audience, so people could actually be reached out by the main theme. You know, there might have been editors who told her it's not a good idea, and they pressured her into doing it. Like, I don't know, I would not know the explanation, but I'm just wondering what it could be.
At the same time, though, from the beginning, she didn't initially write it for an American audience. Like, she initially wrote it for a British audience. And in Europe, like, book banning is not that much of a thing. It doesn't really happen here. So, like, that could have, like, at least that excuse doesn't go for, like, the first 2 books or so.
Yeah, and also Europe, I mean, the UK is not as, does not have as much of the, like, now the UK is having, like, a surge of the religious right that the US has. but there isn't as much of the like we can't let homosexuality exist anywhere. At least to the extent it is in the U.S. The U.S. is sometimes. Mind you, it's still not legal in many places in the U.S. to get married. Like that's just not even a date. That's not even like any. It's still states in the U.S. where we still have sodomy laws. Like they haven't actually been repealed.
You could still get fired in a lot of states. Yeah,
you can still get
out of your housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues. Marriage is like the tip of the iceberg, really. But her, especially, this was really only relevant for the 7th book, I would say. By that time, this was a huge worldwide kind of series. Like, I don't think she meant it to just be for the UK by that point. I mean, this is a very national series that touched so many countries in just about every continent in the world. So I think maybe her fear was that a lot of people would not get access to the books if she had mentioned something that is even illegal in some countries. And maybe that's why. And I'm also a huge fan of, like,
I mean, magic's illegal.
Of, like,
in certain places.
So I do, like, Pottermore and all these other places that have all this extra information that the books didn't have. I totally respect that. As long as it's the original author mentioning it, I usually consider it canonical, in my opinion.
Yeah, I personally consider only the books actual canon, and I like everything else is head canon, which is pretty canon. But it's not.
I think Pottermore canon is like.
It's a separate canon.
Yeah. I think there's book canon, then there's Pottermore canon, and then there's head canon, or like just like fan head.
Yeah. J.K. Rowling head canons are different than actual canon to me.
You're so much better though. Fan canons are better.
Fan canons are great.
Canons are the best.
Queer Ron.
Wow.
This is my
that would have been great.
Gosh, I love Queer Ron. I love Ron. I love Book Ron.
Book Ron.
But the other thing I was going to say is that, like, my identity is not a thing that you should have to be afraid of mentioning.
Yeah.
Like, so we can talk about, like, oh, it would have gone banned in places, but... And I realize that the books exist within a specific social context, but also my identity is not a thing you just get to decide is, like, we can leave it out of the books because it might scare some people. Like...
We should. No, I agree. It's something that
we need more diverse books because people are like, oh, well, people won't read. That's the same thing that happens with authors who are trying to write with characters who are like not white, and they're like, oh, well, people don't want to read that, or even just like female leads, like, oh, boys don't want to read that. They're not going to read that. People are going to be upset about that, or you can't do that. Like, these people already exist. The characters you're trying to make exist, and people keep saying you can't have that because somebody will get upset about it, but.
No, I agree. That's why we should be fighting for our rights and for social justice. It's just that if a whole country decides that they're going to ban a book, then nobody in that country will get it, and that's a huge problem.
I think that's not true. Book banning is surprisingly not always very successful.
Yeah, but in some places the books might not even arrive to certain places. I really don't know too much about the subject, but I do still have that fear that could have happened in places.
Yeah.
And in my county, it would not be in the library if there were openly gay characters. Yeah. It wouldn't be in the library for the kids to read. It just wouldn't be there. I mean, there are not. Like, that's just a thing that happens in Elbert County.
Yeah.
Like.
I hope not for much longer, though.
Yeah.
So it is like time. It has been the hour, so we should end the broadcast. Which is just the broadcast, not the call. But so we should say goodbye to the internet.
Bye, internet.
See if anyone had anything else they wanted to like wrap up on. Thoughts. Finish.
Oh yeah, the quote from J.K. Rowling. I found it, but the discussion was too good to break up. It was not as bad, or like it's very bad, but she didn't say red-faced people. She said, or like this is, by the way, from the Telegraph, so I don't know whether or not to trust this. Mm-hmm. she said, like, empty-headed, self-obsessed, emaciated clones about people.
That's pretty awful still.
I know, terrible. But then the red size thing was in with those women whose only function it is to support the trade in overpriced handbags and red-sized dogs.
Okay, that's really awful.
That's terrible and the worst. And I hope she has since thought about what she said.
Somebody's given her a book on feminism?
Yeah. And then she also says, this is I will end it by saying something okay that she said. Is fat really the worst thing a human being can be? Is fat worse than vindictive, jealous, shallow, vain, boring, or cruel? Not to me. But then you might retort, what do I know about the pressure to be skinny? So she, that's less bad.
Yeah, that's what I loved about that. And I don't remember the other part, but yeah, I'm reading it now actually also. I don't remember those comments. It's probably because it just didn't get ingrained in my head like the rest of it did. But thank you for pointing that out.
No problem. But that was the only thing I had to wrap up.
Cool. So, goodbye, Internet.
Goodbye, Internet.
Bye.